We're excited to be offering this course. I think it's just an excellent group of presenters that we have lined up, and I think it's going to be really good. Today we'll be hearing from Terrell Erickson, who is our Northeast Regional Conservationist. We'll be hearing from Denise Coleman, the PA State Conservationist, and Thomas Morgart, the Connecticut State Conservationist, all on opening remarks. We'll also hear about NRCS environmental compliance from Don Riley, the Regional Wildlife Biologist out of the East National Technology Support Center. We'll then hear about forestry from William Byram, forester also out of the East National Technology Support Center. And then we will conclude today's session with Debbie Sarabian, the State Soil Scientist out of Connecticut, and Jacob Islieb, who is a Resource Soil Scientist also out of Connecticut, and they'll be presenting on basic soil properties. I'll let each of the presenters introduce themselves a little bit more fully at the start of their session. Now, we call this training boot camp, but it shouldn't be confused with the National Boot Camp training. The National Boot Camp training is a separate course, and that may be required for Conservation Planner designation. And Denise Coleman from Pennsylvania, in her opening remarks, will be explaining more about the history of this virtual training that we're having. With that said, I'm going to pass things over to Terrell Erickson. Terrell, thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I am so pleased to introduce this first virtual boot camp for the Northeast. I've been your regional conservationist for 2 years now. My region includes 14 states in the Northeast, from Maine to West Virginia, including all the way over to Ohio and Michigan. Before this job, I was 7 years the Director of Ecological Sciences Division, overseeing science and the multiple disciplines for the agency. I took my first conservation planning course in 1996 when I started with the agency as a biologist. And that course and the principles and foundation of conservation planning have kept me with the agency. I say this in recognizing how important this training is and to welcome you to the boot camp to learn the science of conservation from our best conservationists in the region. So listen up. You will hear and learn about the policy and science building blocks behind conservation planning, including environmental compliance, plants, animals, water, and wetland basics, how to access and interpret data for producers, and some social tips on working with farmers. This is a virtual training. It does not include the field component, which will be needed. Lastly, I want to thank the presenters and in particular your leader, state conservationists, Denise Coleman and Tom Mogart, who have crafted and planned this training for you. So thank you and enjoy the training.
Thank you, Terrell. That's excellent. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Denise Coleman, the Pennsylvania State Conservationist.
Well, thanks, Tim. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you, Terrell, for taking time out of your busy schedule to welcome us today. We certainly appreciate your leadership and your willingness and interest in making sure field folks had technical training in this time this year due to the COVID-19 crisis. Let me begin a little bit about Pennsylvania's background and why we decided to do this. Pennsylvania, for the past 21 years, has had its own boot camp. We don't send people to national boot camps only because when we train people within Pennsylvania, we train a lot of our district and non-governmental organization partners. So it's not unusual for us to have every year to train at least about 60 to 70, not only NRCS employees, but new conservation district staff and other partners in Pennsylvania. So because of the expense and the also the need to let those staff understand Pennsylvania regulations and water quality provisions, we felt it was necessary really to have the boot camp here in the state. So when we talked about this as state conservationists, the idea was not to replace the national boot camp that's held in the Midwest. We really felt strongly that there's a field component and that people should go to the field and still participate. But we also understood as state conservationists that you're probably, as new employees, being onboarded, and you're getting many programmatic trainings at this point in time, and you're also getting many HR trainings. And what's happened is we felt that we wanted to make sure that you, as employees, have training on our foundation, our core foundational work, which is technical delivery and technical assistance. So just like Terrell said, we want to make sure you get good science behind why we do what we do, why we plan the way we plan, and implement practices the way we implement practices on the farm. So with that said, I really want to thank and do a shout out to thank Gary Plowden, who's our state soil scientist, who coordinated this effort and really got involved in the oversight to bring this all together. We originally thought it was going to be 30 to 40 people, and I think you now have 240 on today, or I know it's over 200. And also thank Tim Peters and Tim Kinney on the PA Nrcs staff as well. Both of them have been extremely instrumental in trying to make this happen. And so really want to do a shout out to them as well. And thank you all for participating. Hope that you enjoy the session and appreciate all your interest.
Thank you very much, Denise. We're going to move on to our next presenter, Thomas Morgart, the State Conservationist out of Connecticut. So, Thomas, it's all yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And that clicking sound to me sounds like the old sound of a fencer going click, click as the pulse was going through the line. So maybe we've got some feedback from a farm someplace. I want to thank everybody this morning for joining us for this monumental effort that's been put forward with more than 200 people on this line. We've never used WebEx to this extent before, so if we're having some glitches, we hear maybe a fencer feedback or some distorted audio, please be patient with us. This is the first attempt at this scale, so be patient with us. I want to thank Terrell Erickson for her leadership in helping us pull this all together, Denise Coleman, the Pennsylvania State Conservationist, and all of her staff who have been instrumental in pulling the agenda together and coordinating this, getting the web coordinates out to everybody. If it wasn't for Denise and her staff, this would not be possible, and I can't thank them enough for everything they've put into this. I want to thank all the instructors. We have instructors coming from all across the Northeast region. As Terrell said, that's Ohio and Michigan, all the way to Maine and down to Delaware and Maryland. So it's a big geography that we're working on. So we've really tried to present a regional approach to this virtual basic boot camp that's going on today. So technical training and conservation technical assistance to our producers is what we at NRCS do every day. We really want to focus on bringing these basic skills to you during this training, and as part of that, it is critical to have your involvement. If you just sit on the phone and listen, when the instructors are asking for feedback, please provide them feedback because it's only going to be worth as much as you put into this training. And virtual tools and virtual training are difficult to get responses back. So I want you to be involved and stay involved throughout this course. And I know this will be difficult, 4 hours, 4 days in a row, but try and be involved and try and stay with the team because that will make this training better for everyone. I also want you to remember that the technical training is just really one of the pieces. A second piece we do is actually delivering that technical assistance and technical delivery to farmers and producers. And thirdly, the thing I want to talk to you briefly about this morning is relationships. So in order for a farmer or producer to trust you, you need to develop a relationship with them. You need to, as they used to say, walk a mile in their shoes. You need to understand what their farming operation is today, what they see their farming operation looking like tomorrow, what are their resource concerns they want to address today and tomorrow. Really understand, are they having financial concerns on their operation? By better understanding that farming operation, it will assist you in delivering what that producer truly needs and will meet their needs on that operation. Building relationships with producers are not easy. And so one of the things I would recommend that you do is look within your office or within your region and try to pair up with somebody who has those great interpersonal skills. If you learn from the best, you will absorb what they do, how they talk, how they relate to those farmers, and that relationship building will bring you a long way in your career in conservation, because really conservation is about people, and the better you interact with people, the more likely we are to get additional conservation applied to the landscape. Once that conservation is, once you've built that relationship, selling conservation should come very easy to them. You've got the relationship, they're willing to try new things. This is where we're really going to make great strides in conservation. So I hope everyone enjoys the next 4 days of training. Make sure you stay involved and interested in this training, and that we get a great training for everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. We appreciate those comments. And we will move now into our next presenter. Our next presenter is Dawn Riley. So Dawn, feel free to take it away and go ahead and share your presentation.
Brief introduction, you've already gotten. I am Don Riley. I'm the biologist in Greensboro at the East National Technology Support Center. As you see there on the screen, I'm also the acting ecologist, so like many of you, unfortunately, a lot of us are working in more than one position. And ironically, I agreed to do this presentation just before I was also asked to become the acting national forester for a few days. So currently, I'm the acting national forester and trying to manage some of this compliance workload as well. But not to get into all that and get distracted, but I figured I'd take a quick minute. For some of you, you may not know what the East Tech Center is, so I'll just take a quick minute to let you know that we are as the title says there, a technical support center. We're located in Greensboro, North Carolina, and our staff mirrors in a lot of ways your ecological sciences staff in the state office, where we have an agronomist and we have grazing specialists, we have biologists, and our role is to assist states technically with whatever issues they may come up with. We also support the Ecological Science Division, which is what we are a part of at the national office. So our role is to kind of be a conduit between the national office and your technical specialists in the state. You're going to be hearing from another one of the specialists a little bit later, and William Byram, the forester. But we are here to assist, and most of the time we work directly with your state offices. But by all means, you know, if there are issues, if there are concerns, never hesitate to bring issues forward through your state office, and we'll do whatever we can to help. Now, generally speaking, we do a lot of training, and like all of you, adjusting to this new reality that we're living in, I'm having to do the same. I love doing training. I love standing in front of people. I love interacting. In fact, some of you have been to your states. You may remember me. I don't know. But I enjoy it. I enjoy that human interaction. And so thanks to everyone who invited me to come today and be the guinea pig as the first presenter. So we'll see how this goes. But with that being said, I just want to mention that environmental compliance is a foundational component of all of our work. And this presentation is in no way going to make you an expert. It's not the intent. But my hope is it will bring attention to something that maybe in our lives of, you know, trying to get things done and trying to get obligations made and trying to meet with farmers and meet with district boards and doing all those things, that these are some things that oftentimes get lost. And so I want to bring it to everyone's attention so that you yourself can then take on additional training as needed. I guess the other thing I should have mentioned in my introduction is I have worked now just at every level. I was in multiple field offices as a district conservationist. I went on to the state office as a state biologist, and now I am in the tech center. So a lot of these things I'm going to be talking with you about today, I've been at the field level and tried to implement this stuff. I've been at the state level and tried to draft state guidance on this stuff, and now I'm at this national level working on it at that level as well. So if there are any questions as we go through, send those through the chat box. I'm hoping there'll be plenty of time at the end to kind of cover a few things. But with that, I just want to jump into this primer on environmental compliance. And so for many of you, this is a new topic, and for others, this might be review. Just there's such a broad group out there, 250 people roughly, that, you know, there's people from all sectors and all aspects. And so I'm not sure exactly where everybody falls, but regardless of where you fall, it's critical that we talk about this because it lays the foundation on much of what we as NRCS employees do on a daily basis. If you think about the past of our agency, the SCS, the pre-NRCS days, there wasn't too much concern with being defensible or being in a defensible position concerning environmental matters. If you think about the history of the agency, it was more concerned with, you know, the task of addressing soil erosion problems. Oops, I'm sorry, I went up. Addressing soil erosion problems and working directly with clients to meet their conservation needs. We rarely ever were challenged on any environmental issues as far as, you know, lawsuits and grievances and complaints and those kinds of things. We were a fairly not well-known agency, if you will. I mean, our clients knew who we were, but outside of that, the general public didn't have a whole lot of, you know, understanding of what we were and who we were. And most importantly to this conversation, the majority of what we did dealt with, you know, technical assistance and had very little financial assistance or cost share to offer our clients. So in short, we weren't on anyone's radar screen, okay? But that all changed. You know, if you think about where we are today as NRCS, our program budgets are very large. And we find that the agency's actions are being looked at more and more closely. And we live in this era of government transparency. We live in an era of diversified clientele, expanded cost share programs. We find ourselves in a place to where we are now managing taxpayer money, right, through these FA programs. So it's important that we pay close attention to complying with the environmental requirements and for NRCS to ensure agency conduct when we're managing our business. And that deals economically and environmentally. We need to be accountable. And so we should remember that compliance with environmental requirements protects not only the agency, but also our clients from their legal requirements and their legal mandates. So real quickly, what we want to try to get through today, some of these topics we want to address. We want to talk about the legal frameworks and authorities. You know, what gives us authority to do what we do? What is the framework of that? We want to look at the quote-unquote relevant resource concerns. In other words, those that are relevant in our analysis. We want to talk about those NEPA in particular. If you've never heard of NEPA before, we're going to cover NEPA. But specifically, what are those triggers? What brings NEPA into the conversation? What brings in the requirements to comply with NEPA? Then we're going to talk specifically about NRCS environmental requirements. What are those things in statute, regulation, and policy that we as NRCS employees have to adhere to? And then finally, we're going to talk about, because this is boot camp, and we want to tie that relationship together, that relationship between environmental evaluation and our conservation planning processes that are, in fact, one and the same. So before we get started, a question for all of you to think about. Who do you really work for? You know, think about that as we go through this next few set of slides, and consider for a moment who it is you work for. And know that it's a critical question. And everyone in this training has some idea, and most likely you think everyone else has a similar idea or a similar answer. But in fact, as I travel around and do training and have these types of conversations, I often find that we don't always agree on the answer. If asked, some of you might come up with one of the following, and I came up with a list for you to think about. Some of us would say, I work for the federal government. Some might say, I work for Congress. Some might say USDA or NRCS. Some might go more, philosophical and say, I work for the environment. Some might go more pragmatic and say, I work for my supervisor. After all, they're signing my evaluation at the end of the year, right? Some might go to a higher calling and say, I work for a higher power. Some might go to who we deal with on a daily basis and say, I work for the farmers, ranchers, and non-industrial private landowners in this great country of ours. Some may say, I work for the taxpayers. After all, they're paying my salary. And then some of us, we might just say, I'm in it for myself. So who is right? Who actually has the right philosophy on this? Who has the right answer? Well, to help us, let's look at a little chart. I always like to look at this kind of chart when we talk about environmental compliance. And we have to understand, our three branches of government. I don't want to turn this into a civics lesson. We all had that years ago. But it is important for us to lay this foundational framework to know what it is we can and can't do. So if we think about the three branches, we know there's a legislative branch that makes the laws, right? We have the judicial branch, and their primary function is to interpret the laws. And then we have the executive branch, which executes or enforces the law or carries out the laws, right? And so one way to find the answer is to look at where our compensation comes from. And again, we can arguably say that the taxpayers fund the government and that root source of our compensation, right? But the funds are entrusted and distributed by the federal government. So I think that we can all agree we don't make or interpret the laws, because if we all made it interpreted the laws, maybe the laws would look a lot different. And the fact is we don't have that authority, right? So we work for the executive branch. So as a federal employee of the executive branch, we have the responsibility to execute the laws passed by Congress and to spend taxpayer money wisely. Finally, we provide service to our clients. So if you think about it and you look at this page here, we have our three branches of government. We're right there in the middle in that executive branch. So we work for the executive branch of the federal government, and that is the USDA NRCS. That's extremely important when we start defining what it is we can do and what we can't do and how we should do it. So we work for the USDA NRCS, the federal government. Our clients are those farmers, ranchers, timber producers, and other constituents. And the mission is to help them conserve the nation's soil, water, air, and other natural resources. So as you look through the hierarchy, that's what we do. That's who we work for, and that's how we do our work. So anytime you come to one of the trainings I'm a part of, I throw something like this up on the screen. And it's so important because in order for us to execute our federal responsibilities, we have to understand the framework for those responsibilities. In other words, those of us that work for the federal government, we don't just get to show up and do what we feel is accurate or what we feel is right, or don't do what we don't want to do and do what we do want to do. The reality is, as federal employees, especially those under the executive branch, we have these responsibilities that are defined for us. And environmental compliance deals specifically with compliance with laws, regulations, policy, and agency guidance. And you can see that on the triangle here how those are framed, where laws are the base, right? They're the foundation. And that foundation is what regulation is built upon. And the policy is built upon that regulation. And then finally, at the top of the pyramid, you have agency guidance. In our case, with Nrcs, most of the time that's bulletins, instructions, handbooks, those kind of things that you see on a day-to-day basis. And so what are the differences between these various levels, and how do they affect your work? That's kind of what we're going to be talking about for the next 30 minutes, or so. Is how does this triangle impact your work on a day-to-day basis? So to understand them, let's go through each one of those levels of the triangle and kind of give a little bit, flesh them out a little bit, give them a little bit more context and meaning. Okay, so laws, also known as statutes, right? Laws are passed by some legislative body. Again, we're not part of the legislative branch.
What I want you to do is,
if you don't mind, whoever's not muted, if you don't mind muting your phone, that'd be great.
Where there's some grass. But if you get the hose from the building and just drag it out a little bit, you should be able to stand.
Can anybody hear me?
Places and just spray it. Missed it.
There's phones that aren't muted. Please, folks, if you could please mute your audio. Someone's giving instruction on something about the building. If you could make sure your audio is muted, and we'll troubleshoot that on our end as well. I apologize about that, Don.
And where the funny bright grass is, and then
we will endeavor to persevere. We'll try to keep marching forward, and I will do my best to. There we go. Well, no, we didn't. I was going to say, I do have teenage kids. I've become an expert of not listening and talking, so I'll do the best that I can. So when we think about laws and statutes, laws are passed by some legislative body. In our case, we're thinking Congress, right? And so laws both authorize and limit federal authority and actions, okay? Nrcs has a fairly large amount of authorizing legislation, and it goes all the way back to the Soil Conservation Act of 1935. So when we think about the amount of statute, amount of federal authority that we've been given, we have a fair amount, and most commonly understood are these farm bills that we work under, right? So all the way back to 1935 up to the most recent farm bill are the laws that provide authority that both authorize and limit our actions. So keep one thing in mind, though, that if you can't find it in law, if the action isn't authorized, you can't do it as a federal employee. We are governed as federal employees by the limitations of the law that's been written. And so the only authority the executive branch has, besides that which is inherently drafted into the Constitution, is that which is passed by Congress in the form of statutory law, okay? So that's the bottom level of that pyramid. So the next level up is this rules and or regulations. So the rules and regulations are promulgated, or they're created by federal agencies under what we call the Administrative Procedures Act. So we write these, the agencies, or write these things called regulations, and it goes through this rulemaking process, and it defines how we carry out those laws, okay? They lay the ways in which the agency will implement the laws. And some examples you might know of commonly are EQIP and CSP rules. So once a rule goes through the entire rulemaking process, they are called regulations. So rules are those ones that are moving through the process. Regulations are those ones that become finalized. Okay? One thing to remember about rules and regulations is they do have force and effect of law. However, law always trumps rule and regulation. So even though violation of a law or regulation is illegal and potentially subject to civil or criminal penalties, we have to remember in the hierarchy it's laws and then rules and regulations. But one thing to always keep in mind, and why this training is so important, is we as federal employees have an obligation, in fact we have a requirement to ensure that we do not violate these rules and regulations. An example might be if you advised a client to take an action that violated the Endangered Species Act, and it resulted in a take of a listed species, you could be held personally liable and subject to civil and criminal penalties. So that's why this training is important. It helps us to remember and to understand what our roles are, what our obligations are. And once we move down from the regulations, we get to this layer of policy. And honestly, policy is what most of you deal with on a day-to-day basis. This is generally the level that you're working with when we're dealing with environmental compliance. It's the internal guidance that the agency generates, and it's based on the regulation. So most of our, policy that we think of comes from, example, the general manual. Now, we have lots of policy, but the general manual is the one that many of us think of, okay? It doesn't have force and effect of law like the regulation does, but it helps us to understand how we carry out our responsibility, okay? If the agency policy is not consistent with the law, or if one of us NRCS employees doesn't follow the policy, you have this issue that's called arbitrary and capricious. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute, what that means. But if the action taken by an agency were determined to be arbitrary and capricious, then that's where you hear a lot of times on the news where agencies find themselves under a lawsuit, or you find employees of some agency kind of finding themselves in hot water. So what is it saying? It's a departure of policy are grounds for this arbitrary and capricious. And so to kind of understand arbitrary and capricious, it's a legal term, right? And I am in no way an attorney, so I don't want to give the impression that I am. So I'm going to give you kind of the Cliff Notes version of it. And so arbitrary and capricious basically means that the agency made a clear error in judgment, or that there's no rational connection between the facts and the choices that are made. Now, fortunately for all of us, we have long-standing procedures in place. So we should never have a situation where there's no rational connection between the facts and the choices, because we have all these ways of doing planning, so we generally don't have to worry about that. Now, unfortunately, there are some times where we have a clear error in judgment, and so that's why it's important to understand what our roles are, understand what our responsibilities are, so that we can move forward with clear judgment and clear decision-making by using the processes that have been developed. In conservation planning, the resource concerns, including those special environmental concerns, they're the relevant factors. Those are the things we're observing and measuring, okay? Those are the things that we're basing our decisions on, those resource concerns and special environmental concerns. So what we have to make sure we're doing through our planning process is that we're recommending alternatives that have been well thought out, that have been evaluated, that have been, and the potential effects have been documented, okay? If we can make sure we do those things, we use the processes that we have in place, we will not be found arbitrary and capricious, and you as an employee can feel comfortable that you're doing your job with confidence and with a skill set that's meaningful. And so back to this idea of which one of those are relevant, okay? How do we determine which resource concerns are relevant? And how do we determine which special environmental concerns are relevant? In other words, how do we determine which ones, need to be analyzed? How do we determine which ones need to be evaluated? Well, it's through the planning process. And it's through this concept we call scoping. And scoping happens during this planning process that we use, where we start looking at, okay, what's out there? What do we have on the land? What are we dealing with here? And then I know we're going to be talking more about this as we go forward, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I just want to kind of, lay the groundwork a bit so we can begin thinking about how this works. And this is just a little table that I put together just to kind of give an idea of how this concept of scoping works, right? And so we're over in step 3 of the planning process, and we see the concern, this detection, is it present or not, and what's the range of it, right? And we see three there. We see cultural resources, migratory birds, and riparian areas, and these are three that you probably deal with on a pretty regular basis. And we see there that through our scoping, through our evaluation, you know, we see that, oh, wow, all three are potentially present. We have that checkbox there. What is the extent? What's the location? We can see that's there. We've documented it. And then we move over to the step 4, and we start thinking about it a little bit further, and we describe in that benchmark what is the cultural resource that we're talking about here. And I figured, hey, you know, we're talking to folks up in Pennsylvania and beyond, so there's a Civil War campsite recorded on the National Register of Historic Places. So we know that this site is there. But then we can get, as we move along further, is this relevant to the proposed action? And we see no, because there was no undertaking proposed. And again, we're going to get more in depth on some of these terms, but I just want to kind of give you the concept or give you the flow of how this is supposed to, this thinking process is supposed to work. And if there's nothing else I can leave with you, it's that the environmental compliance process is truly a thinking process. It's an exercise in thinking. And so in this example, we see that both cultural resources and migratory birds, we have both been eliminated from additional evaluation. And we see that no there. And we see that, you know, the riparian as well, we might have some issues going on there. But I want to introduce you to the next concept here that occurs, and that is this idea of mitigation, okay? And we see here that, okay, we have these migratory birds. There's this 64-acre pasture that offers, you know, summer nesting habitat for multiple grassland species. And we said no, that it's not relevant to the proposed action. And so it's like, why? How did we come to that conclusion? And we see prescribed burning was scheduled outside of the nesting period. And so what I'm trying to introduce here is this concept or this idea of mitigation. And we note here that mitigation is allowing us to come to a point of conclusion that for this particular resource, there's not an impact, okay, that it's been avoided. So what I want to dig into a little bit deeper is what is this concept of mitigation? And mitigation is a technique employed when undesirable effects of an action are present. So when we document that there could be some impacts to a resource, this mitigation process enables us to avoid those impacts. It is used to abate the effects and is usually a sequence process, and that sequence process is what you see here on the screen. So when we're going through our planning, the first thing we want to try to do is avoid, right? We want to avoid the impact altogether. You know, we want to relocate the practice maybe, or we want to change when implementation occurs. The next level would be to minimizing the impact, so it's like reducing the degree or magnitude of the action and its implementation. If we can't make that, we move down to this idea of rectifying. That would be repairing, rehabilitating, or restoring, okay? And then we get down to this reducing or eliminating the impact over time. And so when we think about mitigation, mitigation can both be on a scale of avoidance, but it also could be on a scale of time where we say we're going to, over time, eliminate potential impacts. And then the final, if we get down to the very end, we get to this idea of compensation. And honestly, most of us who think about mitigation, we do think about compensation. In fact, we think of compensatory mitigation. So we're taking one and replacing with another. And we see this all the time with things like highway projects or infrastructure projects where, say, a wetland's going to be impacted, and so we're going to restore a wetland somewhere else to offset the impact on the location where we're going to have an impact. And that's considered compensation. But for those of us in the NRCS world, when we're moving through our planning process, as you can see here, compensation is really our last resort, not our first option, okay? So we've talked a lot about laws and regulations and our planning process, and we've talked a lot about now mitigation, but really what we want to talk about to kind of frame this all together is, NEPA. Let's talk about NEPA. And the first thing I want to point out is right there in the title of NEPA, the third word is policy, okay? It's not protection. A lot of people want to call it the National Environmental Protection Act. It's a common mistake that folks make. And the reality is that's not the term. It's the National Environmental Policy Act. And that's really important because this is an umbrella legislation, and it requires federal agencies to follow certain procedures for their actions that covers a broad range of environmental laws. So NEPA in and of itself is not directly a environmental protection law. It is in fact a procedural law that defines for agencies how they're supposed to go through their processes, okay? It's a procedural act, meaning that it only requires that certain procedures be followed, but it does not dictate any particular act. So the act requires an evaluation of the environmental impacts of proposed actions and alternatives. It requires public involvement, and it requires documentation of that analysis and the results to inform decisions, okay? So what it was designed, it was signed into law by President Nixon. Technically on January 1, 1970. So even though it was called the 1969 law, it actually was signed into effect on January 1st. And there were really four major outcomes of the law, okay? The first thing that it did is it declared a national policy, a procedural process to protect the environment, for all federal agencies. The second thing it did is it created this entity called Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ. The president oversees CEQ. The president appoints individuals who will serve for CEQ. And the only way I know to describe CEQ is that they oversee NEPA. They are like the czars of NEPA, if you will, okay? So the third thing it did was it required each federal agency to create or promulgate regulations to implement the act, okay? So NRCS, like all other federal agencies, had to write that regulation, that second level of regulations specifically to implement NEPA. Ours can be found at 7 CFR, or Code of Federal Regulation 650, okay? And the fourth thing it did, it required federal agencies to provide a detailed statement of environmental impacts for major federal actions significantly affecting the environment. There's a lot of words there, right? And we're not going to be able to dissect all of them perfectly, and it's like I say, this is not meant to make you a professional by any means, but it definitely should make you more aware. But what you can see here is this: agencies are required to provide a detailed statement. What that's talking about here is it required, for the first time, federal agencies have a requirement, an obligation, if you will, to notify the public of their intentions and what the potential impacts will be. And the other part to that is it provides an opportunity for the general public to provide feedback on their opinions, okay? It was a communication loop that was created here, okay? So when we think about that, we're thinking about this law puts policies into place. It creates CEQ. It made the agencies write regulations, and then it required the agencies to create a communication process with the general public about its potential actions. And notice I said potential actions, okay? So those potential actions are known as federal actions, okay? Federal action. So we're going to break this down a little bit and define what is a federal action, okay? Most of the time when we think of federal actions, we think of federal funding, okay? We think of money. We think of FA programs in the case of NRCS, right? EQIP contracts, CSP contracts, federal actions because we pay for it. And generally speaking, that is the case. Most of the time when you think about federal actions, you think about money, FA, all right? However, there are those times and there are those situations where the federal government has control without necessarily having money involved, okay, an FA program. Some examples might include an approval of a compatible use agreement, okay, a compatible use agreement that's going to be placed on an old WRP, now WRE easement to do some kind of management, okay, because NRCS has purchased that easement and those particular deed restrictions that have been placed on there. If the individual now wants to come in and, let's say, do something like harvest trees, okay, they can harvest those trees without NRCS saying, yes, you can, or no, you can't. So that is, in fact, federal control. Another might be if we have to subordinate an easement, okay, something to the effect of we have an existing easement and someone wants to change the boundary. Or maybe there's a situation where an easement is going to cross our easement, okay? We're not changing money, but there's that concept of federal control and federal responsibility, okay? One thing I do want to point out and make 100% clear for everyone on the call today, because this comes up a lot and there's a lot of confusion around this. And we have, you know, legal opinion on this. We actually have case law that supports this statement that I'm getting ready to make. And that is, providing technical assistance only is not a federal action, because NRCS does not have control over whether the technical advice is implemented or control over the standards of implementation. So if all we're doing is providing a conservation plan, even though our salaries are paid through CTA, because the recipient of our plan has no obligation to fulfill what's in the plan, that is not, in fact, a federal action. And again, we have legal opinion on that. We even have case law on that. So just remember that as you're moving forward, okay? When it becomes a federal action is when that technical assistance moves to some level of control. So like the case of a a financial assistance program, or that particular plan is in fact, say, a compatible use agreement. So I know it's going to be nearly impossible to have actual interaction on this, but just a quick quiz. You know, you can get 100 on this or not, and that's fine. And you can look at these and just kind of think to your head. I'm going to kind of do these for just a minute. We're going to kind of think about this. Which of these are federal actions? Read them closely because some of them might be a little bit tricky. So we've got the first one there, certifying NRCS standards for a state cost share program. What about granting WRP compatible use agreements? Now, if anybody got that one wrong, we just talked about it. It's a shame on you, you weren't paying attention. The third one, providing EQIP cost share. What about making an HEL-WC, Highly Erodible Land Wetland Conservation Determination? What about subordinating a WD, or I guess now WRE easement for, say, a pipeline? Okay. What about determining whether an FSA 85 approved system meets HEL requirements? Okay. So think about those for just a second, and we're going to pop the answers up here and see what you think. Certifying NRCS standards for state cost share programs. And a lot of people think of this one and say, wait a minute, you said financial assistance. But notice I said for state cost share programs, okay? That's a little bit of the trick here, okay? States are not inherently subject to NEPA. Remember, NEPA was the responsibility of those federal agencies, okay? States can comply with NEPA, but they're not required to comply with NEPA. Here's the tricky little caveat. If states are accepting federal funds, like say through a grant type of agreement or some kind of federal assistance program, then the states become subject just like our clients would be. But if your state has a state cost share program that is, comes through the state legislature and the funding's provided through there, there is no mandate that they follow the state or follow NEPA, okay? If they choose to use our NRCS standards, that's their choice, okay? But it doesn't necessarily mean they have to, okay? The rest of these were pretty straightforward we talked to. Remember, if all we're doing is making a determination, they can choose whether to be compliant or not. It's a voluntary program. All we're doing is telling them, yes, there's HEL, no, there's not HEL, yes, there's wetlands, no, there's not wetlands. If they choose to comply, that's their choice to comply or not. And then, of course, this system down here, we're simply telling them, whether or not the system would meet the legal requirements. So when we think about it, moving on, this idea of federal actions, and we see this concept in the language under 40 CFR, again, that Code of Federal Regulations, and this is actually the NEPA regulations written by CEQ. It reinforces this idea, but does not have meaning independence from significantly, okay? So again, this idea of major, so what does major mean, okay? It essentially means that when you have a federal action that results in a significant effect on the environment, that is a major federal action. So if you look at this little equation here, federal control plus those actions having an impact on the environment equals major federal action, okay? Simple little math problem there just to keep everything in context. But we think of this concept of significantly, and we're like, what does that even mean? Significance is really tied into two concepts, context and intensity, okay? Significant is equal to context plus intensity. And when you think of context, we're talking about where it is on the planet, its locale, the community that it's in, let's say, what watershed it's in. Intensity deals with, more specific things like what are its potential direct impacts, things like public health and safety. Are there unique characteristics in the area? Are there endangered species? Will this action violate federal law? So when we think about this, let's look at this little blurb of text on the page, and we can determine whether or not the effects are significant. Let's say you pull up a CPA 52 document, and you see this language. Installation of Conservation Practice Standards 655, Forest Trails and Landings, and 578 Stream Crossing may adversely affect wildlife. What we see here is an example of something that we would see in assistance notes or on 52, but what we don't see is whether there's enough information here to make that call of significance. So what if we added this picture? Would that provide a certain level of clarity? Well, this stream here looks a lot different than, say, a stream running through the middle of the pasture that has the banks eroded and, the stream bed is covered in silt. We see here riffles and pools, and we see a riparian area that's intact. And so does that give us more, information on this concept of, significance? It does, right? But it still doesn't give us everything we need. What about if we add this text? What if we add this text that says, installation of these practices, just like we said before, could result in an increased sediment load into Cracker Juice Creek. Cracker Juice Creek is known to provide only one of 4 spawning sites for the endangered gnab-eating sturgeon, a species listed due to water quality degradation in its native spawning range. Now that's a heck of a write-up, right? But it also provides a lot more information on significance, okay? We see some really critical pieces of information here. We see that this particular stream segment has sedimentation loads, right? We also see that we have this listed species there. And one of the reasons that it's listed is due to a water quality degradation, i.e. sedimentation, right? And the other thing we see here is that it's only one of 4 known spawning sites for this species. So when we compare these 2 write-ups, we can see a real difference in significance. The one on the left leaves much to be desired. The one on the right really paints the picture of why it's important. And remember, again, what does NEPA require? It requires that we provide an explanation of our action and its potential environmental impacts. The one on the left tells what we're doing. The one on the right tells what we're doing and what the potential impact might be. Okay? So when we think about this idea of significance, where is it used? What's it used for? Okay, and this is where we're really starting to get deep into the NEPA context of things, right? And what we see here is significance is used when we are making our finding, right, our NEPA finding. And we really have, you know, a couple here. We're going to look at these 3 that you as planners will potentially use on a regular basis and figure out, okay, what do all these mean? So the first one we have is this thing called CATEX, or Categorical Exclusion. The second is an environmental assessment with a FONSI, finding of no significant impact. And the third we have is an EIS with a record of decision, okay? Those are the 3 kind of findings that we ultimately work our way towards through this process, okay? And we're going to look at each one of them individually just to, again, give them a little bit more fleshing out, a little bit more context. So the first one is categorical exclusion. Categorical exclusions are these actions that have been determined by CEQ, if you remember CEQ, to not individually or cumulatively have a significant effect on the environment, okay? They are categorically excluded from detailed review under NEPA. In other words, an agency can say, hey, we've evaluated these particular actions in this group, and under these circumstances, we know that there's never going to be an impact, okay? Those are called categorical exclusions, okay? If an action is listed to be able to be categorically excluded, what Nrcs must do is determine that there are no extraordinary circumstances. So in other words, there are these sideboards to using categorical exclusions, okay? If any of those sideboards can't be met, or if any of the actions don't fall under one of these categories of exclusion, then we would have to move to that next level, which would be the EA. But before we move on to the EA, I just wanted to give you a couple quick examples. These are paraphrased. It's not the full write-up of the categorical exclusion, but just to give you all kind of an idea of things that you might be thinking about that would fall under a CATEX. And you can see there GM, General Manual 190, 410.6. If you go look in there, go under E-Directives and you find the General Manual, you look up 190, 410.6, you'll see the list of all the categorical exclusions that are available to Nrcs. And again, just some paraphrased ones here, not the full write-up, but just to give you an idea, including planting appropriate herbaceous and woody vegetation. And that last one down there, implementing water conservation activities on existing ag lands. We have the ability to use these categorical exclusions, and people ask why use them. Well, one major reason to use them is because CEQ has approved them. They are, in fact, the most defensible from a legal standpoint, okay? So categorical exclusions. The next level that we would think about in this significance criteria in making this NEPA finding is the environmental assessment, okay? If the action cannot be categorically excluded, it does not initially appear based on early scoping to have significant impacts, or if NRCS NEPA regulations do not require an EIS, we can use this environmental assessment, okay? It's a shorter document. It's intended to be what they call brief. They're never that brief, but they're, maybe 200 pages instead of 2,000 pages. But they are more brief as compared to the EIS. And the purpose of this document is to provide sufficient evidence and analysis for determining that there was not a need for an EIS. Now, most of you on this call will never develop an EA, okay? you will be using EAs that have been developed elsewhere. But an EA is actually required in a couple of instances in the regulation. One is when land and water resource projects in which state and local units of government receive federal technical or financial assistance from NRCS, and the other actions that may be major federal actions. So it's saying when EIS is required, you can't use an EA, okay? Generally speaking, when we're thinking about EAs, when you look on your CPA 52 document and you come down to that findings section, we have these programmatic EAs for our financial assistance programs. So we have an EQIP EA, right? We have an ASEP EA, okay? Those are the documents that our agency is writing to be overarching for all of our financial assistance programs. And we're going to talk about how we tie into those in just one second. But the third level is this environmental impact statement, or EIS, okay? This is the big one, right? It's a detailed written statement by the responsible official on the environmental impact of a proposed action. This is when you have to do full-scale, in-depth, years-long analysis, and generally speaking, these are very time-consuming. They take a long time to get through, and generally speaking, you work with lots of partners to get these things written. Okay, so EISs are that highest level of evaluation. So as you can see, NEPA requires this kind of tiered approach as well. So some examples is when an EIS might be required. If we're doing stream channel realignment with significant wildlife, or excuse me, aquatic or wildlife habitat, okay, if congressional action may require it, okay, if there are significant cumulative effects, there are other major federal actions significantly affecting the environment. So in other words, we can't get through that list of priorities, and we have to write an EIS. Those are the things where that would draw that distinction. But what I really wanted to get to is those are the findings that we would make, but where do you generally work? And it's this section right here called the environmental evaluation. And this is a unique thing that's available to NRCS. The environmental evaluation is not an EA. It is not an EIS. It is a process that we use, okay, to determine whether or not additional NEPA is needed. And it's a very unique thing to NRCS in that we do not have to prepare an EA every time we do a federal action. Okay, so in other words, every time you take an EQIP application, you don't have to write an EA. That's the value of the environmental evaluation, okay? And what you see right here is it's the part of the planning that inventories and estimates the potential effects on the human environment, okay? And the EE applies to all assistance provided by NRCS. Now, a national instruction was issued in 2010 that requires all states to use the national CPA 52 form. So the CPA 52 form is where we document this EE process, okay? When we look in the general manual under Title 180, it says national plan, it says provides procedures and guidance on implementing the NRCS conservation planning process. So the planning process and the EE process are processes that work together. They work in tandem. They move along together, okay? And the National Planning Procedures Handbook is the process by which we do our planning, okay? It's the process by which we go through the planning process, okay? Then we look at the environmental evaluation in planning. And this new term for you here, new acronym, NPPH, the National Planning Procedures Handbook. It's one of those top-tier things on the triangle, right? And it says federal law requires NRCS planners to consider the environmental consequences of recommended actions and to provide decision makers information about the actions that might significantly affect the human environment. So it's defining this EE as the way that we do our evaluation to determine whether additional NEPA requirements are needed or not. And so the last point I want to make here on this is when we look at NPPH, it says NRCS is required to be conducted required to conduct an EE for all planning and financial assistance. So when we look at all this together, we've got the Planning Procedures Handbook defines how we plan. We have the we have the handbook that talks about what the EE is and it's how we evaluate impacts. And we have the NPPH here saying that we will conduct that EE for all planning actions, okay? So the point is they work together. Our planning and our EE work together for the purpose of determining whether or not additional NEPA analysis is needed or not, okay? So to kind of a conclusion slide here for our NRCS NEPA process, some things that we need to think about, some questions we should ask. Who is controlling the action, okay? If the agency has no discretion or control, it's not a federal action. So is it a federal action? Depends. Who's controlling the action? Can the action be categorically excluded? Does a CE apply? Are there any extraordinary circumstances that would prevent us from using it? Okay. Number 3, have the effects been analyzed? Okay. Existing NRCS EAs are typically the EAs prepared for the Farm Bill. We mentioned the EQIP EAs, and we mentioned those like, the ASEP EAs. If we go through our EE process and we find that we have gone through the EE and the planning process and we're not finding any significant impacts, then we can make that finding. It has been sufficiently analyzed, okay? Number 4, have the effects been analyzed in another agency's NEPA document? Now, this is something you're probably not going to use. You could potentially, but we have the ability to adopt another agency's NEPA document. What I would say about this one is if there's ever a situation like this, you really need to talk with your state lead, your state compliance specialist, and ask them, do we have any other agency documents that we can tier to, okay? It's something that's generally handled at the state office level, okay? And then this last one, is the action a federal action not sufficiently analyzed? What do you do when you find yourselves in a situation where it's not a categorical exclusion, your EE is determining that, hey, we have this potential impact? The answer is contact the state office for assistance. We do have situations where we cannot say we've sufficiently analyzed the action, and we need to do further analysis, okay? So I want to bring back full circle to the triangle that we had earlier. Law, regulations, policy, guidance, handbooks. And this triangle demonstrates our NRCS tools, okay? NEPA is the law, okay, the foundation that we build upon. Council on Environmental Quality has drafted their own regulations under 40 CFR, and NRCS has drafted our regulations on implementing these under 7 CFR. Our national policy is found in the General Manual 190 Part 410 on how we comply. And then we have these 2 handbooks up here that work together to help you as planners stay in compliance with this law, and they're the National Planning Procedures Handbook and the National Environmental Compliance Handbook. So how does it all tie in together? Through this planning process. Okay, we know the 9 steps of planning and those 3 phases, and I'm going to put this little slide here together for you just so you can see where the interactions are, okay? Where the connections are between the content on the CPA 52 and those 9 steps of planning. Now, you notice that it's only the first 7 steps, right? Because steps 8 and 9 deal with implementation and evaluating the effectiveness of the plan. But what you can see here is the crosswalk between our planning process and our EE process, okay? And what I want to point out here, really, what this boils down to, it's a documenting the planning process. Our environmental evaluation is, in fact, documenting the planning process. It's how we did what we did. It's how we got to the conclusion that we got to. It's documenting. Remember, the P in NEPA is policy, right? Are we following appropriate policy? So in review, we have laws, we have regulations, we have policy. Scoping helps us find those relevant resource concerns. Federal action versus major federal action, with that major being tied to that impact to the environment, right? We have our NRCS regulations, we have our policy, and we have our guidance that you use on a daily basis. And that EE, that environmental evaluation, documents those outcomes of the planning process, okay? The 52 is where we document the EE. And what does it do? It documents the planning process as well as documenting the EE process. You'll have these slides available, but you can see here where the information can be found in the General Manual, the Environmental Compliance Handbook, and the National Planning Procedures Handbook. I always recommend folks to go to the e-directives and find the most current version so you know that if there was an update made, you're not losing it, okay? So the e-directives, you can look those up. We also have some resources for you on the Environmental Evaluation series webinars on the webinar portal. You can go here. You can pull these up. These first two are a primer. You see a similar title there, so you'll have a lot of the similar information we had today. We'll have one specifically on the 52, and then we have a series on the special environmental concerns, followed by making the finding and the categorical exclusions. They're a great resource for you. They're about an hour in length each. They really help you out if you want to take time to look at some of those. And with that, I think I was about 5 minutes over. I apologize, but I think I'm 15 minutes early because we started 20 minutes early. So we have a few minutes now for questions. If you would like to ask any more questions about this mystery that is the environmental evaluation.
Don, thank you very much. We appreciate that. We did have a couple of questions come in to the chat, and I will say we went in and we manually muted everyone that we could that wasn't a presenter. So if you have a question, okay, you're going to need to use the chat box from now on to the participants. But the first question that we received was, if a farmer chooses on his or her own to mow a summer nesting habitat, are they then liable to prosecution under the Endangered Species Act?
Okay, yes. So that's a good question. Remember, what we were talking about here was NEPA environmental compliance, and it's the umbrella law that tells us how to comply. The Endangered Species Act, I could give a whole nother presentation just on it, and a lot of the slides would look very similar, like with that triangle. And so if an individual goes out and causes harm, okay, and that would be by definition under the ESA, which would be a take, then yes, they would be subject, because the Endangered Species Act is different from NEPA. It is not a procedural act, okay? It is actually a law that carries civil and criminal penalty. And that's why you hear all the time about folks getting fined for Endangered Species Act violations. And you've heard stories of, $50,000, $100,000. So yes, an individual farmer is responsible to comply with the ESA, just like every other U.S. citizen is required, or actually anyone within the U.S. borders is required to comply with the ESA.
Very good. And then the other question that came in is, if we are working through the CTA program with other conservation partners on a project, can we still use the CPA 52 form and process to ensure NEPA compliance for the work? So there aren't any federal funds being used, but NRCS would be providing the planning in this case. And this person understands that they may not need to go through that process since there's no federal funds, but they're just asking in case it's still an option when working with conservation partners.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, remember, the CPA 52 is a document that helps us document the process. And it doesn't matter. If you remember, the first finding on that last page of the 52 is not a federal action, right? And that would describe what you're talking about. And there's absolutely no problem at all with documenting the planning process, even if it's not going to lead to financial assistance, because after all, we have an obligation to provide our clients with information. And that 52, if nothing else, it's going to help you as a planner remember, okay, what resource concerns are out here? What special environmental concerns might be present? Did I document it? You know, every state has their 52 with links, and it might jar your memory on, oh, man, this one, we need to contact the Corps of Engineers on this one, or we need to contact this state body for this one. So by all means, feel free to use the 52 for documentation because that was its intent.
Very good. Thank you, Don. That is the last of the questions that have come in, so we appreciate everything that you shared. At this point, we will hand the presentation over to William Byram. So, William, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Good morning, everyone. My name is William Byram, like Tim just said, and I think Don mentioned me this morning in his presentation. I also work with Don at the East National Tech Center in Greensboro. I've been in that role for about 1.5 years as a forester there. I started my career, just a little background on me, I started my career in the private sector of forestry, and then got on with the district, and then worked my way up to DC in North Carolina and South Carolina before coming to the Tech Center in Greensboro, North Carolina. Give you a brief update on the forestry discipline for NRCS. Don is the acting national forester for, he's doing the detail there. We have advertised that position. It has closed, and I think they have, are in the process of doing interviews. So hopefully we'll have that position filled. And then you have me in the East. There's the East Forester, the Central states. They don't have a forester at this time, and the West Forester also retired this spring. So the forestry discipline is a little on the low side right now as far as employees and people in those positions. So really appreciate Don stepping up and being acting and helping out with forestry. But today we're going to talk a little bit about, give you a little overview of forestry and how we see it within NRCS. So these are some things we're going to go over today. What does NRCS consider a forest? What are the forestry conservation practice standards? What is the forestry management plan and why is it important? We'll talk about the components in a forestry management plan and what kind of information that you should find in a forestry management plan. And what is our role as it relates to a forestry management plan? So the reason we're going to kind of talk mostly today about forestry management plans is because of our lack of forestry expertise within NRCS. We rely a lot on consultants and technical service providers to help us out in a lot of the states to get forestry conservation on the ground and write these plans. So I think as a new employee, it's pretty important to try to understand what goes in a forestry management plan and what to expect to see and to learn how to do that. So we'll start. I got a little question for you too. Think about a forest. So think about your typical forest. When you hear the word forest, what do you think about? What does it look like to you? What do you think the importance is of forest? So as you think about that, I think you all will have a different image in your mind. And with that being said, NRCS, the agency, we have different definitions of what a forest is. But the one that we use for conservation planning is this one that's on the screen. Forest is land on which the primary vegetation is tree cover. And the use is primary for production of wood products or non-timber forest products. Now, we do have other definitions within our agency. One is forest land is a land cover use category that is at least 10% stocked by single stem woody species of any size that will be at least 13 feet tall at maturity. And it goes on in the definition to say that 20% greater of canopy and leaf cover as you're looking down from above. That definition also says that it's got to be 1 acre in size and at least 100 foot wide. So we don't usually think about that definition much when we're talking about conservation planning, but that is a definition in the general manual. Another definition that would be good to know, starting out, and it comes up a lot in dealing with programs, is non-industrial private forest land. So what this means is that it's rural land that has existing tree cover or is suitable for growing trees and is owned by any non-industrial private individual, group, association, corporation, Indian tribe, or other private legal entity that has decision-making authority over the land. So that's the definition, or our definition, of what a non-industrial private forest land is. And that is that comes out of the 7 CFR that Don mentioned earlier also. So these are our forestry and agroforestry conservation practice standards. So we have 17 that we consider our forestry standards, and they're listed here. We have the Forestry Management Plan, Code 106, which is also, we call it CAT 106 for a conservation activity plan. Then we have access control, fire break, forest stand improvement, forest trails and landings, fuel break, road trails, landings, closure and treatment, tree shrub establishment, site prep, pruning, and woody residue treatment. Then we have 6 on the side for agroforestry, alley cropping, multi-story cropping, silver pasture, preparing forest buffer, windbreak establishment, and renovation. So just a little update on these. We're in the process for, hopefully by year 2022, we are taking the windbreak establishment and joining it with the windbreak renovation. So we're getting rid of one standard there. Right now we're revising multi-story cropping, which that one is being renamed, and it will be called forest farming. So I just want to give you a heads up on a few changes that we're making there. We try to work and revise these on a 5-year schedule. So we have about 7 that's in different stages of the process of reviewing our conservation standards. There are other practices that are commonly used on a forest and may be included in a forestry management plan that aren't listed here, and that's just because they're just managed under a different discipline. So, for example, like a forestry management plan might include prescribed burning, brush management, and herbaceous weed control. They're practices that can be done on forest land, but they're just not under our forestry discipline. So you'll see those in forestry management plans. Which brings us to our next slide, which is, what is a forestry management plan? And as it is defined by Nrcs, a forestry management plan means a site-specific plan that is prepared by a professional resource manager in consultant with the participant and is approved by the state conservationist. Forestry management plans may include a forest stewardship plan, other practice plan approved by the state forester or Indian tribe, or another plan determined appropriate by the state conservationist. So as we look at that definition, you can note here that there are several types of plans that can be accepted. And these plans could be could be written for different purposes by different people. Some of them include conservation activity plans, which is the CAT 106 we talked about a while ago, tree farm plans, forest stewardship plans, other state agency plans, and other plans prepared by consulting foresters or TSPs. While these plans may have their own formats, all NRCS approved forestry management plans must meet the same criteria. NRCS will require other plans developed by partner organizations will recognize and accept other plans developed by partner organizations as long as they meet that criteria. So as you can see, and I wanted to point out in this definition, that states do have the flexibility on deciding what is acceptable as far as the forestry management plan. And because of that variability among states, I would suggest that you get with your NRCS state office to determine state level acceptable forestry management plans and how they align with NRCS criteria. So why do we want people to get a forestry management plan? In short, it's to guide a forest landowner to get from point A, which is the present condition, to point B, which is the desired future condition of a forest. So that's what we're trying to do overall, is just trying to get from whatever the current state is now of the forest to a desired future condition that is determined by you, the planner, in through conversations with the landowner. And in NRCS, it's a great agency, and we have programs that can help with that. So now we'll start going through the components of the NRCS forestry management plan. And there's 5 major components. You have the site and plan information, client objectives, inventory and assessment of existing conditions, recommendations, schedule of operations, and then documentations and deliverables. So component 1, site plan, site and plan information. This is pretty just basic information. You know, you get your name, the address, phone numbers of both the client and the whoever's writing the plan, the total acres covered by the plan, signature blocks. So that's pretty straightforward. The second component, which I think is probably the really important, that I think kind of gets overlooked sometimes, is the client's objectives. This is in not only the forest management plans, just in conservation planning in general. You know, we always got to take into account what the client's objectives are and what they see their goals are, because it's their land, it's their projects, and what they're doing. So I consider this one of the most important parts of forestry management plan. But it must document the short-term and long-term goals, and we state those as desirable future conditions, DFC. Some key points about DFCs and those management plans. They usually cover a 10-year period. So the plan should include DFCs for each stand where the conservation activity is planned for that time frame. And also, we like to see forestry management plans that take into account the client's thoughts about the 30-year time frame to guide the management decisions. And you also need to remember that people change. People change their minds. Things happen. Forest conditions change due to unplanned disturbances or even management activities. And that will result with the plan needing to be updated even before the 10-year period is over. And some clients' objectives could take you out even past their lifespan. So it might take years and years and years to get to that desired future condition. Like a legacy plan that you want to pass down from generation to generation. Then we get into our third component of the forestry management plan. This is kind of the meat and potatoes of the plan. This is where you're going to get all your good information. This is where you're going to get the inventory. What do you have out there? Property level information, stand or planning unit level information, and then the supplemental stand information. Those all will cover different things. So like when you talk about your property level information, there's such things as gives you information on resources such as soil, your soil test, your soil maps and where your wetlands are and your critical wildlife species and habitats. Do you have any historical sites on the land? So that's your property level information. So you're looking at it from a whole, like a 10,000-foot view. Then you get down to your stand and planning unit level information, and this is your where it gets into your forest type and your major tree species, the indicators of stand health and your growth potential and how you're going to regenerate. And then the last part of that is the supplemental stand or planning unit level information. This is where you talk about things like the access to the stand and conditions of roads, trails and landings, and stream crossings. What is the history of disturbance? What's happened there before? Has the track was it clear cut or high graded, 10 years ago? And how do we get to this where we are now with our current stand condition? Continuing on with component 3, the forestry inventories portions of each stand planning unit. It gets into using plot selection and the sampling methods. It records the detailed stand descriptions and measurements. This is where you get into things like the age of your stand, diameter, height, growth rate. And they take this information, and then that's when they come up with the average diameter, basal area per acre, and trees per acre. And we're really trying to get to those, to calculate and record those measurements so we can tell whether the site is overstocked or understocked, or fully stocked. So this is an example of a stocking table for a particular species. So after you determine the basal area per acre, the average number of trees per acre, and the average diameter of the stand, the forester will use a stocking chart to try to figure out if the client's stand is overstocked or understocked. And this is done so you can know how much to thin, if your stand needs to be thinned, or if you need to plant more species for whatever your client's objective is, whether it's wildlife, aesthetics, timber production, some other kind of non-timber production of product. And the fourth component that we're looking for in forestry management plan is the recommendations. So this is kind of where you bring it all together. So you're bringing in you have your inventory, so you know what's out there, you know your client's objectives, and now you're going to look at that and look at what you have in your toolbox as far as those conservation practice standards we talked about earlier, to try to get that client to that desired future condition. So in this section, it should include the recommended forest management activities with a description of the practice to be applied. It should include a schedule of operations with the recommended date to implement the practices. The recommendation section results from being discussion between the forestry professional and the client about the inventory data and possible treatment options. there's often more than one more option for how to treat a stand. The client may weigh factors such as time, effort, and expense related to those different options. So this really needs to be a conversation between you and the landowner and the forester to know what the client wants to do, especially moving forward with and if you're going to do some FA with like an equip contract or something. And then, you know, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, the recommendations of treatments. It's really to connect the client's objectives and the inventory to the conservation practices that will be needed to put the forest to where it needs to be for the desired future condition. And then the last component that we're looking for in the forestry management plan is the documentation and deliverables. So this is where we get to the good stuff. This is where you get the nice maps that show, you know, where your streams are, where your road is. This is where you see what practices, you know, your conservation plan map that has what practices you're going to do and where. I've looked at a lot of plans, and a lot of them kind of lack this map part. So map is a big thing because it's probably going to be the one that's most looked at. Also in documentation, this is where you can document what kind of inventory you did, you know, how many plots you put in, what kind of crews did you do on the stand, and then job sheets or specific site-specific information requirements for practices. And we say all this to get to, you know, what is our role, or what may be your role as a NRCS employee with these plans. And the way we're set up right now, with not having many foresters on board, and relying a lot on TSPs, I think we're kind of moving towards doing these CAT plans and CAT 106 plans, and your responsibility may just be to read over these plans to make sure they meet the NRCS criteria. So what you would need to have would be to have a basic understanding or knowledge with various types of plans that exist and how they relate to the NRCS forestry management plan. So here I just got some pictures of forest stewardship plan and a consultant's plan, and then you have the national template that we have, and then our conservation plans, and just how they all relate. We also need to be able to interpret the information presented in other plans and other types of plans and translate it to fit within the NRCS management plan. So you'll need to take that. You might need to take that forestry management plan and then create the conservation plan from that forestry management plan. And the forestry management plan, they might not use the terminology that you're used to. So it would be good that you become familiar with the silviculture practices and terminology commonly used in your area. Become familiar with the conservation practice codes and job sheets for your county. Talk to someone that has some experience in conservation planning and how they interpret the forestry management plan. And then also don't forget to reach out to your state office to learn how your particular state handles forestry management plans in your state. In your student guide, you should also have been provided with, I think I put 3 different things in there. I put the forestry management plan criteria. It's a 5-page document. At the top it says forestry management plan criteria practice activity code 106. So this kind of goes through what I just talked about with those components and what should be in the plan. Also included a a forestry management plan criteria checklist. There are multiple checklists out there. There's some that's been good ones. There's some that are multiple pages that kind of goes through in more detail. The one I attached to your student guide was just a one-pager. I really like it. I think it kind of covers all the topics that you should be looking for with kind of checkbooks, and then you can make comments. So that's just kind of to help you if you do find yourself in whatever role you're in and you have to check out some of these forestry management plans. And then the last thing that I put into your student guide was also just a forestry inventory guide sheet that kind of walks you through the steps for determining whether a stand is overstocked or understocked. So it kind of tells you how, walks you through measuring a tree, using a prism, and you'll have to get more of those specific details if you don't know how to do those, use those tools. But I think that two-page forest inventory guide sheet is a good one that you can use to try to help you determine if a stand is overstocked or understocked. And then the last thing, I just want to put a plug in for, we do have a new Ag Learn course. It's called Intro to Conservation Forestry. I think it's about, it'll probably take you 3 or 4 hours to go through it, but it's a good intro to forestry and conservation forestry with concepts and just kind of walks you through the process if you don't have any experience with forestry. And with that being said, I think that was my last slide, and I'll take any questions you might have.
Thank you, William. I haven't received any questions in the chat box yet. There was one comment asking about your email, and I think that was answered already. Everyone should have received a contact list with the agenda, and if you didn't get the presenter's emails, reach out to myself or Yuri, and we can get that to you. But that was the only question we had. There was a question about the student guide you were referring to. I'm not sure, were students provided a student guide ahead of time, or I guess slides were provided available on the website?
I think those documents were added to the end of the slide that had 3 slides on it. They were put it in. So they should be in the slide set that they had on that I guess it was a SharePoint or website.
On the website, okay. So anything that you referred to would be on the website?
Yes.
Okay. And I think that is it for the questions. Thank you very much. We appreciate that, William. And with that, we will transition over to our last presentation for the day, which is Debbie Sarabian and Jacob Isley.
All right, so we'll quickly introduce ourselves. I'm Debbie Sarabian, a state soil scientist for Connecticut and Rhode Island. I'm stationed in Tallinn, Connecticut, the state office.
I'm Jacob Isley. I'm the resource soil scientist here in Connecticut, in Tallinn, Connecticut state office.
All right, so we're both stationed together, which works great because we do a lot of work together, and we're here with the Soil Survey Office as well. So this is a really high-cut overview of soils. I really urge you to take on learning more about soils yourself, and if you can, talk to your NRCS soil scientist in your state and learn more about what they do and maybe even shadow them in the field. So again, this is just a very high cut. So soil occurs on the land surface, and it is characterized by either horizons or layers that form from additions, losses, transfers, and transformations, or they can have the ability to support rooted plants. The upper limit of soil is air, shallow water, which we typically go to a water depth of 5 meters, and we call these subaqueous or submerged soils. Live plants or undecomposed plant materials, and the lower limit is 2 meters, which we described to. So the average natural mineral soil is composed of about 50% solids and 50% pore space. And by natural, I mean a soil that has not been human transported or manipulated. So these solids can be a mix of mineral and organic matter, and the pore space can be air or water filled. And typically what we see in our natural mineral soils here in the Northeast is about 1 to 5% organic matter. Obviously with the wetter soils having much more. So looking more at our mineral soil material, it can be comprised of sand, silt, and or clay, sand being the largest in size and clay being the smallest. Now we may not be able to see all of these particles, but we can feel them. And that's what we do hand texturing in the field to feel these particles, and then ultimately we can describe these different textures. So here's another way to think about these particles and see them. So you can think of sand as a huge beach ball, and silt as a smaller frisbee, and then clay even smaller, the size of a dime. So when you see soil scientists feeling the soil between their thumb and fingers, what they're getting at is they're feeling these particles and getting the texture. So each of them feels a little different. So sand feels gritty, and silt is more flour-like, and the clay is pretty sticky. It'll get on your boots and your shovel, and you'll have a hard time getting it off. So besides what we call fine earth materials, which I just discussed, we also look at and describe large or coarse fragments in soils, and we describe these as gravels, cobbles, stones, and boulders. And all soil scientists use these class breaks. And again, it's a way for us to communicate what we see in soils and provide this information to you, and then further provide interpretations. So I'm quickly going to stop a second as we transition to Jacob, but I want you to write in the chat box, what is the lower limit of soil? All right, I see some coming in. People are listening. All right.
All right. Hi, this is Jacob. I'm going to move into discussing soil organic matter, and an informal definition of soils that I've seen and like is that soils are the living skin of the earth. And I like that definition because it really focuses on the fact that soils are teeming with life. It's not just ground up rock material and whatnot. And our soil organic matter fraction, which in the previous pie chart that Debbie showed for mineral soils, we often generalize that and say, somewhere around 5% soil organic matter, in that the rest of it mineral material up to about 50%, and then we've got about 50% of pore space, which is either gas or water. So that 5% organic matter can be broken down represented in this pie chart here. So we've got kind of, in general, two major fractions of our soil organic matter. We've got the stable fraction, which is what a lot of people refer to as humus. And so this is not really actively being broken down. It's kind of been stabilized through the decomposition process. And then we've got the active fraction, which is everything from our living organisms and microorganisms in the soil, fresh residues, and that actively decomposing organic matter fraction. Here's a public service announcement when we're talking about humus, that humus is not the same thing as humus. And why are we concerned with soil organic matter? There's a lot of benefits of this, and you're going to have a whole module later about soil health, and managing soil organic matter is a major component of soil health and soil health practices. But some of these different benefits of soil organic matter in healthy soils are physical. Aggregation, improving soil structure, improves water movement and infiltration in our soils. we can increase water holding capacity for better response during drought times, like many of us are experiencing now in the Northeast. We have chemical benefits, so we're going to increase our nutrient holding capacity, cation exchange capacity. Organic matter actually has very, very high CEC. It can buffer pH. It can help us with contaminated soils. And then there's the biological benefits as well. So we're kind of feeding the food web in our soils, and we're really, managing our residues and our nutrients very well. So you'll be learning more about this later, but we're very concerned with this as far as soil health. Soils in general can kind of be broken into two groups. So the pie charts that we had shown before are really representing mineral soils that are composed primarily of weathered mineral materials, or sand, silts, and clays, and coarse fragments that Debbie talked about. We also have organic soils. So these would be soils that have in excess of something like 20%, 15 to 20% soil organic carbon. These are mostly found naturally occurring in very, very wet environments, so in swamps and bogs or tidal marsh areas. These are not typically managed for agriculture, but there are definitely exceptions to that. We manage cranberry bogs to grow cranberries. There's other areas where there's drained organic soils in old lake beds where they do a lot of vegetable production, truck crops and whatnot. But this term organic soils, and if you see that in a soil survey or whatnot, it's not synonymous with organic farming systems. So when we see our organic labels on foods and whatnot, as far as an agricultural practice, when we say organic soils, we're just specifically talking about soils that are extremely high in organic matter, are mostly composed of various levels of decomposed organic matter. In general, why we're so concerned with soils and this agency and just, as a society is that soils really perform very critical functions for us. Those functions, are food and biomass production. We have a lot of different environmental interactions, biological habitats. They're a source of many of our raw materials that we use. And they're also a structural foundation for engineering. And, throughout your careers with NRCS, you'll be interacting with soils on, multiple levels of this, whether or not it's directly, agricultural practices or engineering structural design. You'll find yourself looking at soil reports or at the soil survey to kind of tease out information about the soils that you're dealing with for any of these interpretive purposes. We also want to note that in soil surveys, we do represent non-soil areas. So we have these continuous soil surveys. I think because all of you, or at least most of you, are in the Northeast, there's really only a few areas in the Northeast that are as of yet unmapped as far as the soil survey. I know the White Mountains are one of them, but most of our areas are mapped, and that's a continuous soil survey, across our land. So we have areas like urban land, which are used to represent impervious surfaces in our urban areas, of course water, and then things like beaches, rock outcrop areas, or even landfills, and there are others. So these are represented in our soil surveys as miscellaneous areas if you see them in there. And even in areas where these are mapped, there may be additional soil information about included areas. So say in an urban area that's maybe mostly pavement and buildings or whatnot, you may still be able to find soil information about the little fragmented areas of soil that you may be concerned with managing if you're working with an urban farmer, a community garden, or something like that. So I'll pass this back on to Debbie to talk about soil formation.
Okay, so thus far we have defined soils. We've learned what soils are made of. Now we're going to talk about how soils are formed. But first of all, I wanted to say that hopefully everybody knew that we were talking metric and not English, and that we're soil scientists, and that's why when we typically describe something, we're taking it in metric units. But when we work with engineers, we transfer that into English for them. So soil formation is important to know because it really helps you understand what is happening or has happened to that soil. And because the soils are so unique, living bodies, they form as this function, as you see this S soil equals F, the function of chlorps. So we'll go into what that stands for. So the 5 soil forming factors, if you can remember chlorp, you'll remember it's climate, or CL's climate, O, organisms, R is release, P is parent material, and T is they're all interacting together over time. So looking closer at climate, it includes precipitation and temperature. So you can see here that depending on the precip and temp, that a lot of the physical, biological, and chemical properties can either speed up or slow down. So think about how warmer temperatures speed up the decomposition of organic matter, and how a lot of rain may transport clays or carbonates deeper into the soil profile. That all has a unique effect on the development of soils. So there are a lot of types of organisms in the soil. There are even ones now that have gone to the moon, the water bears. And these all have important jobs in soil formation, like breaking down organic matter, helping to develop soil structure. Even humans are part of organisms, and they play an important role in changing the formation of soils and how, we move soils around or displace them. They play a huge role in soil health, and you'll hear more about that from Meredith tomorrow on soil health. Here we have a picture of prairie and forest soil. You can see the difference in the thickness of the organic matter on the surface, or what we call the A horizon. So here at the prairie, the grasses have a ton of organic matter from dead roots, decaying grass blades, while you look at this forest soil and it has less organic matter on the surface being incorporated in. Maybe it's faster recycling of the organic matter, but it leads to a much thinner A horizon. So this is a good reminder to just always be thinking about how land use and land cover affect soil formation and soil health. So soil also inherits many traits from the parent material. So soils can be formed in place, or they can be transported and placed by water, wind, glaciers, or gravity, such as a mass wasting event. So the top image shows the maximum extent of the different ice sheets or glaciers, and you can see most of all of New England is covered in blue, and some of New York all the way over to Washington State. And below we have an image of bedrock types, which can help you identify the materials maybe that soil has formed on, or what we call residuum. So Connecticut and maybe other states have soil parent material maps. You can definitely find this in the soil map unit descriptions if you're looking on Web Soil Survey. But you can see here a lot of glacial lakes, which are in orange, where soils are formed on that material, and those are, for us, high clays and silts. The majority of our alluvial floodplains are in the valley, and those are colored purple. So you might think about asking your state soil scientist or looking on your Connecticut Soils USDA NRCS webpage to see if your area has a soil parent material map or a soil Catena chart, and that's C-A-T-E-N-A, Catena chart. So they're really good, both good references to learn more about soils. So the other soil forming factor, relief, or landscape position or topography, whatever you want to call it. It influences how a soil is formed. So here's a nice picture here that gets you thinking about soil being formed on the side of a hill versus lower on the landscape, and where's the difference in the depth of the water table or the amount of organic matter. Will it be more eroded or have more deposition? So these all influence soil formation. And then when we wrap it up all together, all these factors we just talked about work together over time. And you can see these images. We start from 0 time to however long the soil takes, and it's still transitioning, being formed. As we speak, soil is being formed in the ground. So the C material layer develops in A, E, B, or C layer or horizons through, remember, transfers, transformations, additions, and losses. And we have vegetation growing on the surface as well. So think about and write in the chat box, I talked about this, one of them, and it even says on the slide here, write in your chat box what other factors may reset the soil time clock. Yep, flooding, glaciation, all good ones. Definitely humans. All right, so I think we're transitioning to Jacob.
That's great. I was checking out the chat box here. You all are killing it. Okay, so next we're going to talk about soil properties and characteristics. So the soil forming factors that Debbie discussed impart specific properties to our soils, and some of these are unchangeable. Maybe something like texture are pretty much stuck with what you got, at least on our scales of management. While others can vary quite a bit with different management, or like Debbie referred to, the type of land cover, land use land cover, and those would be termed like dynamic soil properties. So we'll try to, as we go through a few of these in more detail, we'll try to cover, where they kind of fit as far as these genetic soil properties or dynamic soil properties. And a number of them that we're going to look at with more detail: horizonation, soil color, redoxomorphic features, soil texture, soil structure, consistence, chemical properties like pH and nutrients, water holding capacity, organic matter content, and saturated hydraulic conductivity, which is a measure of water movement through our soils. To begin, we're going to start with soil texture, and this is getting back to those soil separates that Debbie showed before, our sand, silt, and clay. So soil textures are classes of different proportions of sand, silt, and clay together. So Debbie had said that these different, they have sands are predominantly gritty, whereas silts are very smooth, and clay can be sticky and plastic by feel. So we very, very rarely have only one size of these, like a pure sand, pure silt, pure clay. They typically occur in nature in some different proportions, and our classification systems are an attempt to kind of make groupings of these that have some interpretive significance. And the two main ones that you'll see with your work at NRCS are the USDA soil texture classification system, and many of you may be familiar with some of these names: the sandy loam soils, the clay texture, and the other one is the unified soil classification system, which is often used for engineering design specifications and whatnot. So with some of our engineering design practices, you may see that in a soil report if somebody comes out to log a test pit or whatnot. They may provide that, or they may provide both. They may provide both USDA textures as well. So in our soil test results, if you do any plant nutrient testing, or any kind of other really agricultural focused interpretations, we'll tend to use the USDA textural classification system. And that's often what we speak in, you know, if you think of this like how we talk about soil texture as like a language, most soil scientists or soil conservationists you talk to, if you're talking soils, they'll probably be using USDA texture classes. Texture is inherently linked to soil porosity, and there's kind of two significant properties of porosity in soils. There's the total pore space, and then there's also the size of those pores. And it may be a little bit counterintuitive, but our coarse textured soils like sands, they actually have less pore space than a fine textured like clay soil, but they have larger pore space. Whereas our clay soils, they may have more total space, but the pores can be very, very small. So, and this greatly affects how water moves through soils. As I'm sure everybody, you know, you pour water on sand, you can see how fast it infiltrates and moves through it versus the same thing on like a flat clay soil surface. Available water capacity is another soil property it's highly correlated to texture, and you'll see this in varying response in soils to periods of drought like many of us are experiencing right now. A sandy field maybe looking very dry, probably really you know, hurting right now if you're in a drought area, whereas a siltier, loamier, clayier soil may be able to provide water to plants much further into a drought period. And as you can see in this little graph represented there, as we go kind of clayier in our textures along the bottom axis, we kind of reach like an ideal texture for plant available water, and that's considered like a silt loam texture. So that's a texture that can hold quite a bit of water, and a lot of that water that it's holding is plant available. Once you start to get into really high clay soils, they may be able to hold a lot of water, but they are holding that water so tightly that even, you know, really, really fine plant roots may not be able to extract water from the surface of those tiny, tiny soil particles. So we kind of reach that ideal balance, you know, in our loamy, silt loam soils, and then going either sandier or much clayier from that, we're sort of losing some of that available water capacity from the focus of being able to provide water to plants specifically. Soil structure is our next major soil property that we want to discuss, and in this picture we've got some examples of different types of structure that you'll see. Often in surfaces you'll see this granular, or what's sometimes referred to as crumb soil structure, and then moving down into our subsurface horizons you may see blocky soil structure, platy, there's some others, columnar structure, and then when we get down into our parent materials, kind of our raw materials that our soil's formed in, we'll often see either massive, so there's a lack of soil structure, or if they're very coarse textured like sandy parent materials, it may just be like a single grain type loose material. So what promotes good surface structure or aggregate stability? Plant roots, the amount of soil organic matter, the amount and actions of soil biota, and it's important to consider that these are all things that we can manage. And so again, you'll see these coming up in the later module. Meredith talking about soil health, and it's very important for us to keep in mind that soil structure is one of these dynamic soil properties that can be improved. You can have, you know, healthy soils that have very good soil structure, or it can be greatly degraded depending on our management. And if you have poor structure or somehow that's been destroyed, you know, you can have some of these problems listed here. You can have excess erosion or runoff. You can a lot of surface crusting. compaction, ponding. It can make it more difficult for plant roots to penetrate through the soil, to find water and nutrients. Poor tilth, have a poor seed bed for getting plants started. So, these are why we're very concerned with managing soil structure. Pass this on to Debbie now to talk about soil color.
All right, so soil color can tell us a lot about a soil. If it's weathered, we're looking at minerals that have been breaking down and actually coloring the soil particles. Just like the breakdown of organic matter, it's coloring our soil particles with dark brown or black colors. And it also will tell us, does it have a seasonal high water table? Do we see redoxamorphic features, which are this mix of gray and or red-yellow colors? So redoxamorphic feature means reduced or oxidized morphological features. So as soil scientists, we use a Munsell color chart to describe soil color. The Munsell color system is a means to visually identify and match a color using a scientific approach. It's something that all soil scientists use, so we can talk to each other and we know what each other is saying and what we're seeing. It uses a hue, value, and chroma. So you have here in the upper right-hand corner, 7.5 YR is the hue, and that is like red, yellow, or blue. And we have value on the left side, going from 2.5 to 8, and that is how light or dark a color is. And then we have chroma on the bottom, 1 through 8, and that's how weak or strong a color is. So each color is designated with a color notation. For example, I could have 7.5 YR, 7.2. So you take the hue, value, and then the chroma for the color notation, and then that can actually be transcribed to a color which for 7.5 YR, 7.2 is a pinkish gray, which is on the other. If I had the full book, you'd see that color, those color names. So as I said before, color is a great indicator of what's happening under your feet in the soil, and here we have a landscape with 3 different soil profiles. So I talked about redoxamorphic features and seeing these mixes of gray or red or water being able to transfer materials down the soil profile. So I want you to write in the chat box what soil has the highest water table. Do you think it's the well-drained, moderately well-drained, or poorly drained? Oh, standard lighting for when you saw me doing the color there on the slide, you want to have the sun to your back and looking at the color book. Yep, everyone's getting good. All right, so poorly drained. So you might hear us talk about drainage class, and this is actually an interpretation of the frequency and duration of wetness under which a soil is formed, and by looking at the presence of redoxamorphic features. So we're interpreting the seasonal high water table, that's SHWT, seasonal high water table, which is really important to you when you're building a waste storage facility or a heavy use area, a diversion, you name it, you'll probably want to know this information from your soil scientist. So soil pH, it can be a quick test in the field or it can be done in the lab. It's the acidity or alkalinity of soil. It's measured in pH units, and the scale runs from 0 to 14, even though this one says 4 to 9. It's just showing you some of the pH changes in that arena. But 7 is neutral, so as the numbers decrease, it gets more acidic. As they increase, it gets more alkaline. So it has really a far-reaching effect on plants for nutrient availability, influences our soil-dwelling organisms, the availability of toxic metals. You can see here lower pHs, more metals. And it really affects all of the biological, chemical, and physical processes in soils. So we also have, we look for restrictions in soils, and these can be water and root limiting layers. It could be bedrock, dense till, fragipan. It could even be a man-made feature like concrete. So we use these depth classes to identify where the restrictive feature is in the soil profile. So you might hear soil scientists say that the soil is very deep to bedrock, and that just means the bedrock is greater than 60 inches from the soil surface. And this is, again, it's important to know when you're designing a conservation practice that needs a foundation or something that will be buried like a pipe.
Okay, so taking these different soil properties, and there's more that we won't have time to discuss in much depth today, but we use these properties to summarize soils and describe them into soil horizons. And the same image was used to represent the time soil forming factor before, but as soils change over time, it can often be visualized by horizon development. So as a general rule of thumb, our older soils, those that have more soil development, typically have more horizons. And when we are talking about soil horizons, a soil horizon is just any really different layer in the soil that has, a difference from, say, like a neighboring layer in it. And these can be visualized, like in this graph, you can see the top, the A horizon is primarily separated because it's very darkened by soil organic matter. Soil organic carbon has stained the soil material there, and it's got that really dark color that we associate with our top soils. Below that, we have that kind of brownish oxidized B horizon, so we've got good soil color development in that. I bet if we were able to get in closer to that soil profile and look at it, we'd probably even find some soil structure in there, some of those PEDs that we were talking about earlier. And beneath that, you can see it's got kind of that very dull, unoxidized color. And so we'll use these properties that we've talked about before to make separations or generalize different depths of these soil profiles. And so if you look at a soil description that you receive either automated through Web Soil Survey, or if you look at a series description, or maybe you get one from a soil scientist in a report for a practice that you're working on, that description will have these different layers broken out by horizons. And those are really just representing differences and significant differences in soil properties. There is a nomenclature that we use for soil horizons. So for master horizons, as in these uppercase letters, we have an O, so that it would be a horizon that is formed in organic soil material. So that's material that would have over 15 to 20% organic carbon. In upland areas, we'll often find a thin organic horizon right on the surface, like in forested areas. In most of our agriculturally managed lands, we will not have an O horizon accumulated because that carbon is being cycled faster than it can really accumulate. Below that, an A horizon is a mineral layer, so that would fit in with these mineral soil materials. It may have 5% soil organic matter, or a little bit more or less, but it's going to be darkened by carbon. So It's going to have that darker topsoil color. Some soils, especially older soils, so maybe in kind of the southern reaches of our northeastern area here, may have E horizons, so that's a zone where we've had leaching of material, maybe clays, out of that into a lower horizon. B horizon, probably most of us will see that in descriptions of our soils. That's where we have good soil color development, soil structure. And then our C horizon is kind of that raw parent material again. And then if you have a bedrock contact or something, you may have an R horizon. So that brings us to the end of our presentation today, and just some take-home concepts about basic soil properties that as you encounter different soil types and reports that you either make or have provided to you, that the significance of those is that they're really representing different properties that have some interpretive significance to us for what we're wanting to use the soil for. And those property differences are a result of both the soil formation and how those are managed. So we do have some of these properties like soil organic matter content, soil structure, things like that can be maintained, improved, or degraded. And then we have other things maybe like texture that we just kind of have what we have, and they can't really be changed on any kind of grand scale. Different soils are better suited for different land uses and managements. So good conservation planning can often involve kind of being the matchmaker with this. If you're working with a producer that is thinking about doing a certain thing and it turns out that the soils that they have really aren't a good match for that, we can kind of help consult them through that process and maybe find a better match, or it may be something that we need to talk with them about soil health practices, maybe some different management to try to improve what they have to get better results for their intended practice. You can learn a lot more about soils. USDA, NRCS, we've got a lot of national and state level resources, so I would encourage you to check out the national websites as well as your own local soils websites on the NRCS web pages. And like Debbie mentioned before, reaching out to your state soil scientists and resource soil scientists, they are really there to serve you. Our internal customers, being conservation planners, I really consider that a main customer of ours as we're doing work. So if we can help provide you that Katina chart, like Debbie said, talk with you about the soils that you have, that you might be working with, please reach out to them. And definitely become familiar with your soil survey, using Web Soil Survey. If you have any questions about that, reach out to your specialist. So with that, we will open it up to questions. I think we'll be doing those through the chat box still, and we really appreciate everybody's attention for this module.
Thank you, Debbie and Jacob. We did have one question come in earlier, and I don't think it was clarified, but the question was, is the 2-meter soil depth relative to sea level or to the upper local limit?
So when we make soil description, I think that was a reference to the depth to which that we describe soils. And so that would be from like the soil surface down for a typical soil description. We often target trying to describe somewhere between 1 to 2 meters, which is like 40 to 80 inches, and that can depend on how we're able to excavate. Like if we're hand digging a pit, it's probably going to be closer to like a meter for that description. If we've got a good backhoe pit or a truck probe or something like that, we may be able to target that depth. I know that Debbie also had mentioned earlier the subaqueous soil mapping. So in our coastal areas, if you are looking at any subaqueous mapping, say for restoration aquaculture or anything like that, we do describe soils in our coastal areas down to a water depth of 3 to 5 meters is about the limit of where we map in those areas. And but as far as the depth of the soil material that we describe, it would still be trying to target that 1 to 2 meter soil depth.
Very good, thank you. And that's all the questions that I've received in the chat box. So, here's maybe one more question. What is the role of the state soil scientist in the planning process? Is it supportive primarily, or are there some practices where soil scientists need to be involved?
Well, each soil scientist kind of plays a different role in each state. For me, I'm involved with wetland determinations and on-sites. If engineers need to see what the depth of water table or restrictive feature is, will be called out. We also do ground penetrating radar. We'll do PXRF investigations or evaluations. We'll assist with soil health practices as well. We're actively working on an agreement looking at soil health different management practices with UConn on an agreement. So we're really involved a lot, I think, with the planning process, and we're involved a lot with conservation planners.
I'll just add to that oftentimes you look at the soil survey inventories, and if there's any question about the accuracy of the mapping, or if for the specific practice, if there's a concern about specific soil properties, you can definitely reach out to the state soil scientist and request soil assistance to get an on-site soil investigation. And so that could be for a various number of practices. We do them for engineering design, test pits for that, and whatnot. So definitely, if there's any question about soil stuff, please reach out.
Jacob, I'll let you take the one on, is the soil survey being updated question.
Yes. So the way that the soil survey offices are organized now, they cover fairly large areas in the Northeast. Our soil survey offices are often covering maybe multiple states. They're not really organized on our state political boundaries. They follow these areas that are referred to as major land resource areas, and those are groupings of kind of similar climate, similar soil parent materials, similar agricultural management. So we have one here in Tolland, Connecticut that covers most of southern New England and the lower Hudson Valley. There's one over in Belmont, New York. So they're kind of scattered around, but they are actively working on updates, and those types of updates can vary. They're often not doing total remaps of soil survey anymore, as far as redoing line work. A lot of the updates are trying to maybe fix issues between neighboring county soil surveys. So a lot of the soil surveys were created going back in time county by county, and so we have some issues with the data because of how those were created, with differences along county boundaries, that kind of thing, or state boundaries. So they're working on updating those. As I noted earlier, there's still some limited areas that have never been mapped before, so I know that staff are being targeted, like up there in the White Mountains, to try to finish the soil survey inventory up there. But, the Soil Survey Office, that's another resource for you all. So if you have any questions about the soil survey mapping, you can reach out to Soil Survey Office staff. And if you are noticing any issues as you work in your areas, any consistent issues with the mapping, or certain problems that when you create an inventory in Web Soil Survey and then you go out to the field, you keep seeing some issue, I would really encourage you to communicate that to the Soil Survey Office. You're not going to hurt any feelings doing that. There's probably the people that originally did it aren't working there anymore, so there's no real ego with it. but they would be really interested in hearing those issues because, again, you all are, are probably our biggest customer with the soil survey, and so if you're having issues, they want to know about it.
Very good. There were a couple other questions came in. I don't know if you can see those, Jacob and Debbie.
Yeah, I was going to talk about unique soil formations. Well, there's something that it doesn't offer protection, but it's something that we identify soils as prime farmland soils, statewide important, local or unique farmland soils, and those identify and help with the ranking for our ag easements. And then there is a plan to incorporate, and they're actively being worked on, ecological site descriptions into soil survey in the east. So we have preliminary ecological site descriptions that soon will be attached to the soil map units.
All right, thank you very much. I think that covers the questions that have come in. Thank you very much, and that'll conclude our meeting, so we'll look forward to having you tomorrow. Thanks.